everyone. For this afternoon session, I'm hoping to keep everyone awake after the lunch hour with a really thrilling session that I have on access to finance for farmers organizations. So basically, to give you guys some background on it, SAFIN has been working with EFAD, two teams at EFAD, the private sector investment team and the FO4ACP team. And we have been working on developing a survey to basically understand access to finance, where it stands, what the key challenges are, and trying to understand where some of the key gaps are to identify essentially, or to work with partners on how to develop solutions to improve that access to finance. So we built this on top of a first phase. So the first phase was launched by EFAD and FO4ACP and focused on East Africa, and it was East Africa and South Africa, so sort of Anglophone. And based on the findings of that first phase, we launched a second phase, which really sought to, first of all, expand the geography to have a better understanding across Africa, so including West Africa, into Asia, including India and 3 countries in Southeast Asia, and some islands in the Pacific as well. And the idea was also to include a few things. So first of all, try to up the response rate, which had been relatively low in the phase 1, and also try to add some aspects which were interesting to us, which were around green finance or climate finance, as it were. So the second phase was quite successful. We got 220 responses, 97% response rate, a whole bunch of countries covered. And here, just to give you sort of the context on the responses that were received, and this should give you a better idea of how to interpret some of the findings that we have, right? Because I think that's really important to have. So first of all, in West Africa, we're seeing that in terms of the farmers organizations or FOs that were covered, we have the largest distribution of types of FOs, whereas in Asia, we have mainly cooperatives, right? So that's going to be important once we start looking at who's providing finance, their access to finance, and some of those other things. In terms of India, for instance, we find that the institutions that we covered were also very specific to India, and maybe only representative in terms of, or in the context of India. So difficult to compare. And you'll see that when we get into looking at those results, India is often left out, as is the Pacific, because ultimately they contributed 5% to the survey with sort of some almost erratic responses when you compare them to the rest. So other important things to compare when we're looking at representation in terms of just sheer membership. West Africa and Asia have a majority of very small farmers organizations, smaller than 500 members. Meanwhile, when we say that our 220 responses cover 4.8 million people, 72% of that is India alone, which is 40 of the 220 farmers organizations covered. So again, like, representation is very important to keep in mind. And finally, when we look at representation in terms of gender and youth, we find that really sort of East and Western Africa have the lowest representation in terms of women within the farmers organizations, but then in terms of youth, they have the highest coverage there. So what have we found? What's really come out of the data so far? And so also to let you know where we're at with this, these are preliminary preliminary findings. We're in the process of writing the final report, which should be coming out before the end of the year. So, any insights, comments, thoughts that you have on what we're finding here are welcome as we go through the final stages of the report. But here we're essentially finding that in terms of sheer amounts that have been raised by these farmers organizations, West Africa is clearly sort of on a decreasing trend. When we look at some of the ranges, the first one being raising anything between 0 and 10K, this is over a year period, to over 70K. Whereas in Asia, we sort of see the opposite trend. India is sort of on par with West Africa, and East Africa is the orange, which has sort of a similar trend until the over 70. But what are we seeing in terms of the sources? So where are they getting this money from? And I think here we get into some of the interesting findings where West Africa is very diverse. And that includes informal and local money lenders. So when you're thinking of sort of some of those smaller amounts, which a lot of the West African farmers organizations are capturing, they really are all over the place in terms of where they're getting the money from. Whereas if you look at East Africa, we have 78% of the farmers organizations that say that they've received some money from the government, much lower for West Africa. Whereas in Asia, we really see a high percentage focused on formal providers in both the private and public sectors. If we look a little more closely to just those farmers organizations that were able to raise funding over 70K, so those that were able to get high amounts, where did they get those from? So in all regions, we see that banks represent a very large amount of the investment captured, or at least this is representing where they're getting their money from. In terms of Asia and the Pacific, we see that there's much higher volumes, and this is just volumes, not just having access to money from government, but actually in terms of volumes, Asia and the Pacific have received a lot from the government. Then in West Africa, we see that, again, we're seeing more of that diversity where MFIs are included, as well as value chain specific groups. So in West Africa, we found sort of these value chain specific groups that would lend to farmers organizations working along those value chains, and that's where a lot of the higher amounts were captured. So when we ask the farmers organizations how they feel about their access to finance, this is what we're finding in terms of Asia and India. This is a feeling, this is what they're reporting to us, that they feel like their funding gap is below 50% of what they already have. So they would only require to meet their needs about 50% of what they already have access to. Whereas in East Africa and West Africa, it's for 70% of the farmers organizations surveyed, above 50%. So there's a huge contrast really between those two regions, at least in terms of their feelings on access. And then if we're looking at the question, do you feel like you have access to suit your financing needs? West Africa really stood out with 93% of respondents saying no. So that's over 60 farmers organizations covered. So what does this mean in terms of the types of needs that were reported? Working capital is obviously the highest product in terms of demand. Here again, there's an interesting contrast, and I find this to be an interesting finding, where we see that in Asia, working capital is actually much more versatile in terms of the way that it's used. Some of it has to do with just the sheer fact of having access to working capital, which we see through their satisfaction with the funding that they have, their access to banks, to government, et cetera. And the fact that working capital also is much more flexible in terms of the terms. So the interest rates, and in terms of also the tenors, which can go up to 24 months or higher in certain countries where it can go up to 3 years. So working capital as a tool is much more versatile. Whereas in East and West Africa, we found that essentially the fact that they have more limited access to finance to begin with has them respond more broadly in terms of what they would like to have access to. And here we see higher rates of demand for fixed assets, financing, demand for trade financing as well. Or at least that's our interpretation also of it. So what are the challenges, key challenges that we've noticed in terms of accessing finance? Interest rates and collateral requirements. That's across the board, definitely the highest challenges reported. But then when we're looking at a regional level, we look at West Africa, where the cost of borrowing is a particular challenge. When we ask farmers' organization what this is due to, the whole process, but also the fact of having to deliver business models, et cetera, is actually quite costly because they go to third parties to develop those things for them, and it becomes extremely expensive for them. Whereas in East Africa, we actually found a resistance to external lending, which we still have to interpret, but one hypothesis could be the fact that there is access to government funding, which could maybe make it less interesting to get to try to get to banks or formal sources. Then in Asia and India, there was a lot of difficulty around completing the application, which I think also aligns with easier access, and their main challenge is around completing the process. On the next, can you switch? Oh, okay, wait. Is this the next one or did it jump one? No? Okay. So then we went to green finance. And here again, I think a really interesting finding. Basically, the first question is trying to understand, what kind of activities are you engaged in when it comes to climate? And here you can see, blue for West Africa, yellow for the Pacific, gray for India, green for Asia. Everyone is active. We have a lot in reforestation, a lot in climate adaptation, but we see a lot of activity. When we ask, on the other hand, whether they actually have any access to dedicated finance for climate, we get 2.7% of FOs surveyed, and this was only in phase 2, that have received any specific climate finance. Now we know that also is subject to interpretation because a lot of the activities are actually projects which are financed separately. But I think this in and of its own is actually quite interesting in terms of how we want to think about opportunities of where to work. So can you, okay. So another one around digital, just the fact that we see that the farmers organizations that have digital access to financial services are facing less challenges than those that don't. What that means, how we still would need to look into that further, and the fact that the exception there is around the application process is also an interesting one. Whether the application process for online financing is any more difficult is, I guess, a bit of a question mark. But these are the findings that we have around digital. Next slide. Okay, and then we looked at the farmers organizations that actually provide financing to their members. And trying to understand here, first of all, what are the product needs? Again, working capital. It came up on the top. But what was interesting when we asked what products would you like to offer your members that you don't currently have access to or the ability to, most of them were related to risk management. And it's basically sort of covering the risk of their members in terms of emergency loans and insurances, both in West Africa and emergency loans in Asia. When we're talking about what the key challenges that they have in terms of being able to offer loans to their members, regulatory constraints were top for West Africa, whereas in Asia, it was around liquidity constraints. And our interpretation again of that is, if Asia has a lot of cooperatives, a lot of those cooperatives do have the ability to provide financing, then essentially they just need more money to do it. Whereas in West Africa, our understanding is that there's more restrictions on the ability of farmers' organizations to provide those types of funding. And a lot of the farmers' organizations actually work alongside MFIs to provide the financing directly to their members. Interestingly, I think it's worth mentioning that in India as well, there's very little financing for the farmers' organizations covered from the organizations to their members, because banks are required to provide agricultural finance and therefore have products that go directly to the members. So there's very little farmers' organization financing. So conclusions. First of all, I think very obvious, there are huge differences in regional approaches. So whenever we're thinking of how we as SAFIN might want to work together, I think this aligns again to our approach of taking a regional look at things and working at a regional level, because the issues that we're seeing are very specific to the regions, to the regulations in place, and to the environment there. Working capital is a very versatile tool. I think that's an interesting finding. It's not going to replace asset financing, long-term financing, but it is used in just a myriad of ways, and the flexibility of how that tool can be used is also worth looking into when we're considering what the needs of farmers' organizations are in different contexts in different countries. The engagement of government and financial service providers. That's where we're finding at least the largest amounts are. It's an obvious one, getting the private sector involved, getting funding from banks, but we're really seeing that in terms of the large amounts, those are farmers' organizations that are plugged into the financial sector and have access to those to the banks. Climate change, it's clearly an issue that is directly faced by the farmers, that are serviced by the farmers' organizations. It's something that they're going to be dealing with no matter what, and they're going to have to borrow in order to address it. So the issue and the need to, and their involvement in activities to actually address it is not a question. Access to specific finance to actually support that is clearly not there yet. And then finally, just in terms of how the data is collected, and this is a reflection on the survey itself, you know, the types of farmers organizations that have been covered in different regions. Now, we really worked closely with our partners to help us identify farmers organizations to include in the survey, but we're not necessarily comparing apples to apples. So it's not giving us a full picture, and we have to keep that in mind as we're analyzing the data. So where do we see opportunities? Working capital, again, sort of, you know, where it makes sense, where it can be used in a versatile way, it's really worth continuing to work on, and there's a huge demand for it. Green finance solutions, you know, what that means, what the right approach is, we know that that's a big question mark, but we know that the need is there and that people are actively engaged already. And then gender lens investing, certainly in Africa, West Africa is something to consider. Then de-risking to incentivize private sector investment. We see the importance of private sector. How can we engage them more around farmers' organizations? That's going to be an important one. I think that could probably apply also to policy or trying to work with governments to make that more forthcoming. But also TA, the importance of TA when we're looking at some of those challenges that the farmers' organizations are facing. How can TA actually be provided to address those specific challenges? And then the importance of digital. How can we maybe promote more digital? We're certainly seeing here that it does have an impact on the challenges that they face. So we should consider actually introducing more of those digital solutions in terms of their access to finance. Next steps. So what are we going to do now? We're finalizing the survey report. As I mentioned, we're going to be doing this over the next couple of weeks. We're currently working with the working group that has been set up by Prasoon in Asia. We've already convened farmers' organizations and some of the key stakeholders in the Asia region and in Africa to discuss the findings of this survey. We hope to be able to work with them more on the development of a solution and bring some of our partners and key stakeholders on the ground to have somewhat of a design clinic to discuss, what the best approach could be for that, and then, working in the next year to support those groups through the implementation. And I think that's it. So I don't know how we're doing on time, but do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
Is this the first report that you do of this nature, or is this you've done several of these already?
Of the farmers organization,
Yeah.
we had the phase 1 only.
Okay. When you say that you're going to publish the report results, you're going to publish basically what we're seeing, right? The data.
It's going to be, it's going to be more detailed
Right.
into the
But
data that we have.
The follow-on question is, I saw some really interesting things in that data that you presented. Have you identified areas of further analysis and drilling down?
That's going to be coming out in the report.
In the workshop or in the report?
No, no. I think there's going to be two areas. One is going to be more around that sort of workshop approach at a regional level. I think it's absolutely clear that what's coming out of here more than anything is areas for more analysis. How we're going to go about that could be, as Prasoon was mentioning, through another survey or more work. Some of the things that might come out from the workshop might be further research.
Right.
Sorry.
Sorry, no, I'll just try to close it here by saying, well, as you consider the ways that SAFIN can, add value, as we were talking about at the very beginning, and then strengthen or consolidate its relevance in certain areas, I think that is going to give you quite a few clues, depending on the analysis that you do on products, sectors, geographies, demography. I think you have really interesting raw data there that you can work with.
Thanks. I've been very honest. I'll continue being very honest. We have a ton of data, and I think that there's a lot more that we can even do with the data that we have. There is also a timeline that we have to respect in terms of coming out with a report. But I would love to talk with any of the partners here who have interest in digging into that data more or exploring specific areas and collaborating with us on that. We have Heifers, as you know, Pranjit, with us working for the Asia. We can do it on a regional basis. I think the regional approach still makes sense. That's one thing that we're seeing, and maybe there's different areas to look at in different regions. But we're open. The data's there. We need to leverage it.
No, thank you. This is really interesting. I'm just so sad that Caribbean was not included there. That's not your fault. I think I have to talk to the manager. Actually, the manager of this grant now has changed, and Marco. So Marco now is a little bit more sensitive to Latin American. So it would be really great to have this. Well, if you're planning now having a phase 3 of this survey, have a module cover also the Caribbean and perhaps attach a module that replicates what you have done for phase 2. Definitely really important because we are blind basically in the Caribbean. We want to work there more, but we don't really have entry points, and this could be really an interesting opportunity for IFAD to understand better how to work farmers organizations in the Caribbean.
Right. That's really good to hear, and obviously I think as we start working at a regional level and maybe digging into the data, maybe starting to think about solutions or way forward that we want to address some of these findings. Certainly, we're willing to support on a phase 3, but maybe again we're a 3-person team, so as much as IFAD can maybe put into it, we can help bring the data together and all of that.
For us, it's a marginal investment. Oh, sorry. It's about having the support from the division,
Yeah.
Of extending the survey.
Yeah.
But I think the grant will have
Yep.
There's also an issue about getting some of us involved in the design of the survey, the analysis, more than happy to contribute.
Fantastic. No, that sounds great. Anyone else? Or none? No question? No, Emily? Oh, okay. Oh, great. Oh. Okay, so Andrea, thank you for the question. I don't, so this is really what I think. Right now, this is also one of those areas for further exploration. First of all, as I said, I think that the 2.7 is, it's also kind of purposefully there to shock. It is true, it's the real number that we got. But when we spoke to farmers' organizations, they did point to the fact that a lot of the activities that they have are project activities. And so they come with a separate budget. But we also know that that budget, and it's coming from a lot of DFIs, isn't, or development or government development organizations, isn't necessarily covering all of their needs, and that there's still room and need for specific climate finance. So what that number actually is, not sure. Willingness of FOs, I very much doubt it. I don't think that, given their access and what we're seeing in terms of working capital and everything that's coming out of this, they have very limited, let's say, they're not very finicky on the type of finance that they want. They need finance. Certainly in West Africa, they need more finance, and they really struggle to access it. In Asia, they're more satisfied with what they have, but they're using working capital. So they're not super complex in terms of what they're trying to get access to. So I don't think it's a limited willingness. I don't think that it's available to them, and I don't think that they necessarily know that it's an option. That's how I would interpret it. Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Marisa, thank you. Yeah, that would be fantastic. So this is, yeah, and in Africa we can come together, and I know you guys are working with AMEA, and we're probably going to be bringing AMEA on board as well for some of the interpretation around this data for Africa. So we'll be working on a working group for Africa over the coming months. So I don't know if there's any more questions. Yeah.
Just on, we know that, say, the FOs often act as SMEs. I'm trying to also make your link to SMEs. And sometimes some of them actually own SMEs. So was there any different, I asked that because often the financial institutions have a different, like some will lend to FOs, but in many cases, they'll only lend to the incorporated SMEs. At least this is in Asia, it depends on the country. So I'm wondering if you made any of that kind of differentiation when you're doing your sort of baseline data.
No, so that's a really interesting one. We haven't asked the questions to capture funding that might go to a different entity that's managed by the FO. That we don't have. But here's another area for further research on data that we already have, is that we've actually asked what value chains they work in and what activities they do in terms of processing, which is, let's say, beyond production. So we have that information, but we haven't gotten to the point of finding any relevant findings for us on how that influences their access to finance. One thing that we did look into is, for instance, if they're working cash crops, we would expect a higher degree of access to finance, which would be logical, but we haven't.
Most farmers organizations, when they have finance, I mean, it's trade finance, right? They're usually buying in advance. I mean, that's what you normally see. They're able to buy from their producers with cash and stuff. So did you do that kind of, the types of products, did you distinguish?
So we have, and that was actually on, so you could see working capital, asset finance, and trade finance. Now, in terms of trade finance, again, there's very little, if anything, in certainly in West Africa, which was the phase 2. In Asia, it's coming up and it's emerging. I think what we're lacking is that is a product offered by banks, whereas a lot of the trade finance actually just happens between commercial entities, right? It's the SME with the farmers organization, and that we didn't capture, even though we tried to. We asked the question specifically, but the internal value chain financing, which we set out to capture, we didn't, just from the responses that we got. So maybe that's clarity of the questions. We really tried to work with the farmers organizations. I mean, everything was translated into local languages, explained by local consultants. But I think that's part of it too. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll stop here. We can talk more. Obviously, this is very much in progress, and we want to work with you guys on it going forward. And I'm going to pass it now to ISF advisors, Hayden.
Great.